More than half a century ago, Adolf Hitler set out to invade all of Europe. Today, European lands are faced with the threat of a new war. For the first time after World War II, although the conflicts whirled on Ukrainian soil, the side effects of a full-year war were felt all over the world. Although the issue seems to be a war between Russia and Ukraine over security, ethnic and economic interests, it turns into a structure that we witnessed and knew during the Cold War period. The Ukrainian War is not only at the level of the European strategic stage, with its forces reflections, current and possible extensions at the global level, it's become the main conflict of our time. The reflections of this war, both at the economic and social level, at the security and political level, have greatly affected countries. In the midst of the ongoing military tension, the current activity on the sides of the conflict, and the lack of a solution in the foreseeable future, the relations between NATO and Russia have escalated badly. The main crisis point of this conflict was the seas. Both the Mediterranean and the high seas have become crisis points for the Russian Navy and NATO naval vessels. At this point, the crisis experienced by the Russian Navy in the international seas, which was faced with a heavy destruction in the Black Sea, is progressing on a much more critical course. The Kremlin is certainly not on the side of causing a crisis, because they have a clear front on which they are fighting. However, they also wanted to make the Russian threat felt. NATO's responses to this threat are always on the table. On the other hand, NATO defines some of the Kremlin's moves as unprofessional and professionally eliminates the current crisis possibilities. What happened in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea the other day was the professional behavior of NATO against the phenomenon that the Russians wanted to feel. The Spanish Navy's high-altitude patrol boat Centinela intercepted 2 Russian ships in the western Mediterranean on Tuesday and began tracking and tracing. According to a report from the Spanish Defense Staff, EMAD under the Spanish Ministry of Defense, 2 Russian ships were designated as the Admiral Kasatonov frigate and the Academic Passion tanker. According to EMAD, Centinela is now integrated into the permanent operations framework of the Spanish Armed Forces, where it conducts surveillance and security missions in the waters off the southern coast of Spain. Its primary purpose is to protect national interests in Spanish sovereign waters. A ship reportedly carrying military supplies and equipment from Russia was seen crossing the Black Sea recently. The report says that the Russian ship Sparta 4 slipped silently into the sea with supplies before heading for the port of Novorossiysk, possibly providing ammunition for Russia's invasion of Ukraine against the increasing presence of the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean. 3 NATO aircraft carriers are traveling in the Mediterranean as a message to Russia in the second year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not slowing down when it comes to displays of deterrence against potential adversaries. 3 NATO carriers from the United States, Italy, and Spain are conducting multi-carrier operations in the Mediterranean as part of the planned deployment of the USS George H.W. Bush Aircraft Carrier Strike Group to the U.S. Navy Europe Operations Area. NATO will operate in close coordination with support troops from Greece, Turkey, Croatia, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Albania. It is also clear that the buildup of Russian ships in the Mediterranean increases the risk of an incident. Russian Navy ships cross the Mediterranean in numbers unseen, even in the Cold War, posing the risk of an incident with NATO forces in the normally stable region. We can say that this increase coincides with an aggressive attitude similar to the stance of Russian naval forces in the Baltic Sea. Many experts have expressed the opinion that the approach of the Russian frigate Admiral Gorshkov, armed with hypersonic missiles to the central Mediterranean after the exercises in the southern Mediterranean, may worsen the already complex and turbulent situation. It would be wrong to say that Admiral Gorshkov would make such a contrary move. However, it will not hold back from maintaining elbow contact. The Allies have repeatedly affirmed the right of all nations to cross international waters peacefully. US officials have previously said that interactions with the Russian Navy occur with a certain frequency and are generally safe. However, to understand what it might cost for a Russian ship to encounter the George H.W. Bush Aircraft Carrier Strike Group in the Mediterranean. After this time, we need to examine this issue well. In other news, Russia's Ministry of Defense confirmed that 6 amphibious warships that left the Baltic Sea this week are on their way to the Mediterranean, where they say they will participate in naval exercises. This amphibious fleet can swing north from the Mediterranean towards the Black Sea. There is already considerable debate among experts and observers over whether these ships will be the true final destination, which will put the ships in Ukraine in a position to support a possible new large-scale Russian intervention at the end of March. Separately, the Russian Navy's Vishnya-class intelligence collection vessel, Vasily Tadishchev, was spotted crossing the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean. It's unclear where the ship went, but it's possible that her appearance was somehow related to these other Russian naval movements. Russia said the naval exercises in the Mediterranean will be part of a wide array of naval exercises around the world, including in the North Atlantic and Pacific regions, which will involve a total of about 140 ships and 60 aircraft. In the statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it stated that the purpose of the exercise is a naval and air force exercise to protect Russia's international interests in the world's oceans and to encounter military threats to the Russian Federation. The language used by the Russian Defense Ministry to describe these naval exercises is in many ways similar to the way that the Kremlin describes the nature of large-scale exercises in Belarus scheduled to begin next month. The massive deployment of troops and supplies, including Iskander short-range ballistic missiles and warplanes associated with these exercises, has raised concerns from officials in Ukraine, the United States, and elsewhere. The fear is that all of this may be a cover to put these forces in position for an anticipated new Ukrainian offensive. On the other hand, NATO, by being cautious about Russia's attack, tried to prevent the possibility of a conflict between the alliance and Russia for a while. In fact, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated that NATO is a defensive alliance after the NATO summit, which was held the day after the attack began. He had declared that they were not seeking conflict with Russia and that they would not be involved in the Russo-Ukrainian War. However, NATO emphasized that all kinds of military, financial, and humanitarian support will be given to Ukraine against Russia, and now it is trying to continue its support by keeping its promise, stating that political and practical support will be increased for Ukraine, which is on the defensive against the Russian invasion. And that support will be continued to help Ukraine win. NATO underlines that Russia is fully responsible for this war, which is a clear violation of international law and the UN Convention. He stresses that efforts will continue to be made for peace, security, and stability throughout the NATO region. The US and NATO allies are trying to take a stance that emphasizes unity against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They are trying to make Russia pay for this invasion. First, they imposed heavy economic sanctions against Russia. Now they are supplying the Ukrainians with weapons to fight against the Russian invasion and empowering NATO countries to make it clear that they will resist any invasion from Russia. NATO aims to continue increasingly all kinds of military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine this year. Naturally, this indicates that it will be a year when tensions with Russia will be high as a result. Although this war was ostensibly referred to as the Russian-Ukrainian War, it turned into a war in which Ukraine found itself and had no influence on its results, despite the fact that the costs paid by all parties have increased in direct proportion to the continuation of the war. And the scenario has become the only realistic solution. Unfortunately, it does not seem possible to reach this last scenario in the short term. Considering all of this war may expand further and may have different reflections on us in the form of a frontal war. In other words, although this war is an ending war for Ukraine, we can also say that it's the beginning war for the Western world. The Western world is trying to take a strong position against Russia every day and tries to prepare its relations with Russia, according to a definite but undetermined result. Russian warships are withdrawing from Crimea for fear of missiles. Moscow was last forced to evacuate warships from the Crimean port during the siege of Sevastopol in 1941. As it is known, many developments have taken place in the Black Sea since the beginning of the war. Russian warships were blown up, ports attacked, and submarine gas pipelines hit. The Kiev forces dealt heavy blows to the Russian Navy with these attacks. The Ukrainian army, which is getting stronger day by day, becomes dangerous for the existence of the Russian Navy. Russia, which cannot maintain its superiority on land or in the air, cannot achieve success against Ukraine in the seas. The developments of the past day once again revealed the weaknesses of the Russian Navy. The Kremlin has shifted its Black Sea fleet in Crimea, Sevastopol to safer waters in Russia. A senior Ukrainian military intelligence official said in a statement, Vice President Major General Vadim Skibitsky emphasized the influence of Ukraine's offensive force in Russia's taking this decision. Ukraine intensified its attacks on the Crimean Peninsula near the Kremlin, fearing that precision-guided weapons might hit or run out the fuel of elements of the Russian fleet anchored in the Sevastopol docks. Moscow made the decision to withdraw. Skibitsky stated that Russia's Naval High Command has redeployed BSF ships to the port of Novorossiysk in the eastern Black Sea coast, located in the Kuban region of southern Russia on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. Novorossiysk is quite far from active front lines. Novorossiysk is very far from the anti-ship missile launch sites and well out of range. According to Ukraine's Southern Joint Forces forecast, that day, 2 Russian missile-carrying submarines left the Sevastopol base and joined a fleet of 11 ships in the eastern Black Sea. Skibitsky expressed that the Kremlin is concerned about everything. According to the Major General, the Kremlin is deeply concerned about the upcoming spring offensive, the advance of Ukrainian troops, and the targeting of Kiev's medium-range missiles at the Russian Navy in the Sevastopol port. A pair of long-range attacks were launched last week on the southern Russian fuel storage and production facilities on the Russian mainland, which are critical to the fuel logistics supply chain in Crimea. A mass drone attack on Ukraine's Terminator fuel base hit a diesel fuel storage facility adjacent to the only bridge connecting mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. Russian air defense claimed to have shot down 10 to 12 kamikaze aircraft. However, 2 of the kamikaze planes reportedly crashed into fuel reservoirs and exploded, causing a massive fire covering an estimated area of 1.3 kilometers squared. Russian authorities announced that 188 firefighters had brought the fire under control. The attack appeared to set half of the base's fuel tanks on fire. According to open-source satellite photos released by the U.S. group Maxar, hundreds of tons of diesel fuel were potentially destroyed for use in Crimea. As a result of the fire in another night attack, a Ukrainian plane struck buildings and fuel transport infrastructure at the Ilskoye refinery about 150 ft from the Taman plant in Russia's Krasnodar Oblast. State-controlled Russian news reports and social media showed that smoke continued to rise from the Ilsk plant. Ukrainian journalist Andriy Tsaplenko stated in his Telegram post that the primary role of the facility is to supply fuel to Russian military units in Crimea, especially the BSF. Serhiy Braumarchuk, Ukraine's regional defense commander in Odessa, stated that the Sevastopol port is no longer a safe haven for the Russian Navy. The pro-Russian news platform Radoika made statements about the long-range attacks launched by Ukraine on Crimea. The news platform stated that Kiev may attack Crimea with more drones next time and said that Russia should wake up. It is known that the Ukrainian army uses locally developed Neptune anti-ship missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles developed by the USA. Both systems have an effective range of 150 to 200 kilometers. If Ukraine can advance its war lines even 50 kilometers, it will reach the power to easily hit Sevastopol with Kiev missiles. So what awaits Russia? Putin's house of cards looks more vulnerable than ever, and questions are rising about what will happen next. Vladimir Putin's strategy has always been based on pitting his opponents against each other by holding a divided house. Putin prevented them from uniting and usurping it. But ever since he invaded Ukraine, Putin has been playing the high-stakes game that could cost him his presidency, if not his life. For more than 2 decades, Putin has successfully pitted different factions of his potential rivals against each other. The critical flaw in Putin's strategy was that he thought he had created a political, perpetual motion machine that would keep him and his regime in power forever. But now the Russian leader's plans are faltering, and he doesn't seem to realize it because, like most dictators, he has a weakness. Putin's weakness is his own arrogance. Putin's pride has been blinded by the failures of his war, the rising discontent in his army's ranks, and the unspoken anger of the Moscow elite. For years, it was considered that Putin provided stability after the chaos in Russia of the 1990s. Now the president has become the epicenter of Russia's 21st century chaos. Putin is not running a reclusive country, completely cut off from the outside world like North Korea. On the contrary, Putin runs a country with dozens of billionaires, most of whom have their own private military companies, who see the reality of Russia's position in the world and have both the means and the motivation to end the house of Putin. These billionaires realize that the Russian leader will not live forever. Many of Putin's favorites who have survived for years at the whim of their bosses will undoubtedly lose everything when he's no longer there. To prevent this and ensure their survival, they must start forming alliances. These alliances led Putin to loneliness, even in his own country. Also wanted for war crimes, Putin has become a heavy albatross on the necks of the Russian elite. Russia will not be able to get out of its current economic crisis or return to normal until the war in Ukraine is over. Putin's strategy of allowing and even encouraging open disagreements among his subordinates can be deadly. The war continues to plunge Russia's economy and long-term stability into the abyss. The public that supports Putin today is sympathetic to the arguments put forward by a figure like Prigozhin. As the Russian economy deteriorates, citizens may be persuaded to side with Putin much faster than Moscow realizes. History has shown that ordinary people will often support the harsh speeches of a populist figure like Prigozhin, who blamed the Ukrainian war on China's feet. The plot that the Kremlin did not foresee is where people stand in the end. Prigozhin and Shoigu may not survive the post-Putin era. Those who want to win the favor of the West and melt billions of dollars and end this conflict before it causes even more dire consequences for Russia are already looking for the Messiah who will start the post-Putin era. As with all investment plans, early entrants receive the highest dividends. The big game of who will come after Putin has already begun. There are undoubtedly many smart people in Moscow who know that Putin's day will come, and they must be on the right side of history. It seems that the success of Ukraine, both on the front lines and behind the front lines, creates an earthquake effect in the Kremlin. Fear of Kiev missiles mobilizes Russian ships in Crimea. However, these events are just the tip of the iceberg. The real earthquake is happening around the Russian oligarchs. As the Ukrainian war drags on and the failure of the Russian military is revealed, Russian elites are apprehensive about their future.